Broadcasting live from atop the Rocky Mountains, the crossroads of the West. You are listening to the Liberty Roundtable Radio Talk Show.
Vice President J.D. Vance walks. No deal. Trump sends Navy to Hormuz. Draft registration becomes automatic. Wow. Killing and indifference. Pope promotes peace, calls for end of war. The Donald attacks him online. Happy to have you along, my fellow Americans. Sam Bushman. I've got Lowell Nelson with me, campaignforliberty.org, to break down all hard-hitting news that the networks refuse to use. Welcome, Lowell.
Well, thanks for having me, Sam. You got some pretty hard headlines there, I'll tell you.
When it comes to Lowell, ladies and gentlemen, it's always hard-hitting, but it is framed in a constitutional reality check. Constitutional government and the 10th Amendment, Lowell.
Well, that's what I like to do. We like to talk about the principles involved and then show how the current, administration or regime or the current activity, whatever it is, runs counter to the Constitution, because only by discerning the way the Constitution is being trampled on can we preserve it, right? I mean, that if we don't understand that the current activity is violating the Constitution, then we can't remedy the problem. And so part of understanding our awful situation and getting ourselves out of it and back into a position of righteousness really is we have to understand when the Constitution is being violated. Now, this first little piece here is talking about the 10th Amendment, constitutional government and the 10th Amendment. Quote, the crisis we face today is the culmination of decades of offenses against the Constitution by Democrats and Republicans, justices, presidents, and Congresses alike, all of whom have essentially rejected the idea that the Constitution possesses a fixed meaning, limiting the power of the U.S. government. The principle of constitutional government is rendered meaningless if the Constitution is treated as a document whose meaning is endlessly malleable or, even worse, impossible to ascertain. At different times, different parties have deemed it expedient to construe the Constitution in whichever way will rubber stamp their political policies, end of quote. Yeah, Sam, that's a really good summary of what's been happening to our Constitution over the past decades and maybe even the past century or so, because the people in power, they changed their interpretation of the Constitution to basically rubber stamp their policies. And so, if we accept that as a summary of the problem, then what is the solution? Well, the author of this column quotes Brian McClanahan at McClanahan Academy, quote, what the American political system needs is a good dose of federalism and decentralization and return to the Constitution as ratified through the 10th Amendment, end of quote. And when he says through the 10th Amendment, I think what he really means is the Constitution and the first 10 amendments. And
what he really means is the fact that we, the people, maintain all power, and we've delegated certain constitutional divisions of power jurisdictionally to them, but with parameters around it. And we retain the power is the point that he's highlighting, I think.
Absolutely right. Limited government as envisaged by the Constitution is only possible, he writes, when the locus of power resides primarily at the state level, meaning the state and local jurisdictions where the people are sovereign. And so, yeah, I think you're right, Sam. And this goes right into the next column, this one by Andrew Napolitano.
And before we go to the next column really quick, though,
yeah.
the quintessential point here, ladies and gentlemen, to understand is we don't mean to attack people, okay? What we do mean to do is highlight when something's right or when something's wrong, when something's good or something's evil, when something's constitutional and when it's not. Because that's the only clear way we can move forward is calling good good, standing for what's right, standing with the supreme law of our land, the Constitution, highlighting not only what's wrong and why, but most importantly then, providing solutions to the problems we face, Lowell. That's critical in today's environment because very few people really get that last mile done, sir.
Well, and what you said, Sam, is really the problem being pointed out in this column, because the people in power, they won't criticize their president, even though their president is the one coloring outside of the constitutional lines, because they like it when their president wields power that's not his, if they're the ones in power. And then they complain when they're not in power. They complain about the other party's president, but because they're a minority power, meaning they don't have the majority, then they can't do anything about it. But it just, like a pendulum, swings back and forth between the two parties in power, and nobody ever actually shuts down the activity that's outside the Constitution. So the only way you can do it...
we beat to a different drum, ladies and gentlemen. We complain when the Constitution's violated, and we applaud when it's obeyed.
That's right, no matter who's in power, no matter which party has the majority. So that's exactly right. That's what we need to do, folks. Even if your own party is in power, whether it's a state, local, or national level, you need to complain whenever they violate the Constitution, even if it is your own guy in power. That's the key. So Andy Napolitano's column last week was a series of thought-provoking questions. He didn't make a single statement in this entire column. Now, Ron Paul employed this, what I think is a rhetorical technique, several times on the floor of the U.S. House. And I think it's really quite effective. But we can't cover all of the questions, so I just chose 3 or 4, maybe 5 of the most interesting ones to discuss here. He says, quote, does the government execute the will of the governed or the will of those who finance its officials? Does the Bill of Rights, which I call the list of prohibitions, of course, restrain the government? Are the levers of government power pulled by those the governed have elected or those we don't see? Question mark. End of quote. So I think he's asking these questions in light of the great suspicion that Trump attacked Iran at the behest of Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And the longer I live, Sam, the more I've come to realize that most government is a scam to benefit certain players, meaning those who support those in power. Those would be the players, at the expense of general liberty. Now, I believe the Bill of Rights should, but does not restrain the government, and that the current administration is doing the bidding of the hegemonic leaders in Israel. But
well, one quick way Lowell, is it said like this: when the government's afraid of the people, we have liberty. When the people are afraid of the government, we have tyranny. And I don't agree that it's one or the other 100%, but where do you think we sit today is the real question, right? I mean, that tells the story, Lowell. When you literally have a man like the Pope calling for peace, calling for an end to war. He's a religious leader, okay, of the Catholic Church. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints leaders called for peace as well. And so the Pope promotes peace, calls to an end to war, and Donald Trump attacks him online for it.
Wow.
I mean, imagine that kind of interaction. I mean, you would think President Trump would be like, hey, we agree we want peace too, but it's not that simple. I mean, he can say whatever he wants, but to attack the Pope because the Pope's calling for peace? At some point, you lose credibility big time. And now this killing indifference kind of really points to the issue, Lowell.
Sure does, Sam. Now, it turns out that here in the West, we celebrated Easter last week. But those in the Eastern, like Ukraine, for example, they celebrated Easter this week. And so it's very appropriate for the Pope to call for peace. And just as we here in the West called for it last week, we need to be calling for peace not only every week, but every day. I mean, we should be suing for peace. An end to the killing, because we're hurting families, we're hurting individuals, we're ripping apart the fabric of a society, and it's just not good. No matter who it is, I don't care whether you're white or black or red or green, whatever color you are. We shouldn't be hurting other people, right? We shouldn't hurt people. We shouldn't take their stuff. Those are cardinal rules to live by to love one another as you would have them love you, right? Do unto others as you have them do unto you. To love God and to love man. That's the two great commandments, and everything else hinges on those two great commandments. Love God and love your fellow man. Regardless of what color, what culture, religion he is, we should love them because they are our brothers and sisters, and all the children on this planet are children of God, and God loves all of his children. He doesn't play favorites, right? I mean, nor should we. Well, that's a little digression from the column, but if we go back to Napolitano's questions, he asks, which is worse, a president who kills whomever he wishes, or a Congress that funds the killing and is indifferent to the moral, constitutional, and legal consequences? End of quote. Well, in my opinion, Sam, this question lays the blame squarely at the feet of both the president and the Congress, right where it belongs.
Exactly where it belongs, Lowell.
Yeah. I mean, the president does not have the legal, moral, or constitutional authority to kill whomever he wishes, and the states do not grant the executive that authority. And not only should Congress not fund such killing, but Congress should impeach any president who does so. Which, the Congress doesn't have the guts to impeach the president for that because they want their own president when he's in power to have the power to do these indiscriminate killings. I guess that's why they're doing it. Which leads to the next question: can Congress fund a war that it has declined to declare?
No.
Why are undeclared? Yeah. And so
Not
go ahead,
constitutionally
Sam.
they can't. No, obviously they can because they are, but constitutionally they can't. Morally they can't. The reason why is because the founding fathers intended for the Congress to document, one, what the funding would be for by line item. Two, if we're going to go to war, then we need to document what we're going for, justify ourselves before a candid world that it's a just war, just like they did with the Declaration of Independence before the, real war, if you will, the Revolutionary War. And then most importantly, to define the objectives and get out. How do we know when we're done? See, right now, the way we know we're done was when Donald feels in his gut that we're done. That's all. Other than that, we have no idea. And the point of the founders was, hey, if we must go to war, justify it and document when we'll be done, right?
That's exactly right. And so we can't be silent about this. We have to inform our representatives in Congress about this travesty, right? I mean, Sir Thomas More said basically that silence is consent. And so if we're silent about this, then we're actually giving our consent to what Congress is doing, and they shouldn't be funding this war. I mean, last week, Sam, I sent to Mike Kennedy, my representative in Congress, a 12-minute clip where David Stockman was on Tom Wood's podcast, and there was a 12-minute segment where David Stockman assessed the military capabilities of Iran, and he showed that Iran is not a threat to the United States. And so, and very, very keen and a very sharp assessment of Iran's military capabilities, and proving that they're not a threat, to the United States, and therefore, why should we go to war against Iran at the behest of Israel, the hegemon there in the Middle East? It just doesn't make any sense.
And of course, Larry Johnson highlights the statements from Iran recently, right?
Yeah, he sure did, and this really caught my eye because, Sam, we don't hear their perspective much, about the U.S.-Iran conflict. We don't hear the Iranian perspective in the mainstream media here in the States, and so it's important. I thought it was important, at least as I read through this, to see what they're saying and what they're thinking. Now, Johnson quotes this statement released by Iran's Supreme National Security Council. And, of course, they use the word enemy throughout this statement, and by enemy they mean the United States. Quote, the enemy, in its unjust, illegal, and criminal war against the Iranian nation, has suffered an undeniable, historic, and crushing defeat. Iran has achieved a great victory and forced the United States to accept its 10-point plan. End of quote. Now, remember, folks, this is the Iranian perspective. At least it is the propaganda spun by the Iranian government for consumption by its 90 million citizens, as well as the rest of the world. In other words, Iran is claiming victory just like Trump is claiming victory and they both can't be right. I mean, it's probably a lose-lose. They're probably both losing, but anyway, Iran is claiming victory, and they go on to state here, quote, under this plan, talking about the 10-point peace plan, right? Under this plan, the United States has in principle committed to guaranteeing non-aggression, recognizing Iran's continued control over the Strait of Hormuz, accepting uranium enrichment, lifting all primary and secondary sanctions, ending all UN Security Council and IAEA resolutions, compensating Iran for damages, withdrawing U.S. combat forces from the region, and halting war across all fronts, including against the resistance in Lebanon. End of quote. So that's their expectation, right? Again, not what you hear from CNN.
And we're not saying we agree with all of it, but, a lot of it, though, they have the sovereignty and the right to say.
Mm-hmm. And so this statement, goes on and by saying that the U.S. was battered so badly that the U.S. was seeking an exit from the war, and that this was driving the Zionists crazy. And obviously, Israel did not approve of the peace talks in Pakistan because they attacked Lebanon in hopes of breaking up any possibility of a deal there in Pakistan. And we now know...
Vance called no deal for sure, and now Donald Trump is sending the Navy, right? And so David DeCamp kind of highlights this over at antiwar.com, highlighting what happened here, Lowell.
That's right. Trump said he ordered the U.S. Navy to impose a blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, and the U.S. military announced it would begin blocking all ships leaving or traveling to Iranian ports starting at 10 a.m. Eastern time this morning, Monday morning, basically 90 minutes from now. And this came after about 21 hours of talks in Pakistan.
What time does it start?
Yeah, 10 a.m. Eastern.
So
that would be...
It's already started.
Oh, it's already started. You're right. 22 minutes ago, the blockade, supposedly began. And so this came after 21 hours of talks in Pakistan between Iranian and U.S. officials. And so basically, they apparently, what they're saying is that they agreed on almost everything except the nuclear issue. U.S. is saying, well, Iran they can't enrich uranium, even though you need to enrich it for civil purposes somewhat, but not to 90%, but to 65%. And so that's one of the big sticking points. And another major sticking point was the fact that Israel has refused to agree to a ceasefire in Lebanon. And so Israel continues their airstrikes on
So Israel demands
Lebanon.
war. Donald demands the control of the strait and that they don't get nukes. And they're saying we have the right to be left alone and to create enriched uranium if we want to. That's really the breakdown and the battle point, folks. But here's the bottom line. I think Trump's hoping he can get out of the war for sure, but I don't think he can. And I pray it doesn't, but predict it'll get worse. When the Trump calls for peace, instead of President Trump saying, I agree and echo that call, let's have peace, let's work this out, Trump literally attacks the Pope. That, ladies and gentlemen, tells me we are not on a peace trajectory. That's for sure. Well, we've been talking about what that might mean for you and I. Are we going to be in a war? How long? What's that going to really be? What does that mean? Well, we're finding out now from another antiwar.com story. How do you say his name? Hastrop? Edward Hastrop has this piece?
Hasbrook,
okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so our good friend Kirk Crosby brought this column to my attention yesterday because, and they've been really quiet about this, by the way, the Selective Service System on March 30th, that was just 2 weeks ago, sent the White House its proposed regulations for what they're calling automatic draft registration. They sent this over to the White House for review and approval before they are to make it public. This is the first visible step in the transition from trying to get young men to voluntarily sign up for the military draft to trying to sign them up automatically by aggregating data requisitioned from other federal agencies. And so this little tiny service, the Selective Service System, They have the power, apparently, to requisition. They have to order other federal agencies to give them all the information on us, the people. And
well,
so
the problem is this change was authorized by Congress and then signed into law by President Trump already.
Well, actually, it started with Biden. So this was not a Trump 2.0 initiative. Documents released in response to Hasbrook's FOIA request show that the legislative proposal for automatic draft registration was drafted during the Biden administration by the former Trump 2016 Oregon State campaign director, Jacob Daniels. He's still at the Selective Service System today, and he is one of the Trump loyalists who got jobs at that Selective Service during Trump's first administration. And so I think you're half right, Sam. I think this is, both.
Well, Congress passed it, but
Biden,
Donald Trump signed it. That's why it's law now.
Yeah. So we and this will be coming out soon. As soon as the White House finishes their review of it.
Yeah, December is when they say it takes effect by law.
Yeah, so there's talking December of this year, and thereafter, then basically, they're not expecting U.S. males when they turn 18 to sign up, because they will be automatically signed up for the draft. Now, does this mean they'll be drafted? Not necessarily, but it means that they're registered for the draft automatically. So that
But when they make moves like this, though, and we're not told the truth, what happens is this will further erode already historically low trust, Lowell. That's the problem with this. This happened on Trump's watch, and they're making more and more and more subtle moves towards war. In every case, the discussion about women being put into the draft as well. I know it hasn't passed yet, but again, they're working on that. And when they work on these 10 different things behind the scenes that smack of war, you can be sure that they have visions of war, Lowell.
Yeah. And when they have visions of war, then I have visions of destruction of families, lives broken apart, and wounded, dead and wounded coming home in body bags and on crutches. And that's the way to decimate a nation, to decimate a country, is to send them into war. Notice it's not the people at the top, it's not the politicians that get hurt. They're the ones making the money, along with their cronies in the defense armament manufacturing industries. It's the ones who actually sent to the meat grinder that get hurt. It's their families that get hurt. It's their society, their culture that is damaged by war. War is a no-win situation, right? Nobody wins in war except those who manufacture the bombs and planes and tanks and so forth. And they go home with a lot of money in their pockets. But who really gets hurt? Well, it's the people who get killed and maimed and wounded, right? For every person that gets killed, there's 5 or 6 that are maimed and wounded in ways that just cannot be registered and equated to a monetary scale. Sam?
We're about out of time, but I want to ask you this, Lowell, before the end of the time we have together, and I want your succinct answer to this. This is really important. Wartime is when we historically lose the most liberty, sir.
Yes, I agree with that, Sam. And in fact, the founders knew that too. And there's a quote, I'm not sure if I can quote it exactly, but basically, war is the germ of all the problems that eat liberty of the people, right? I mean, they hollow out the liberty of the people when we're engaged in war, Sam. The founders knew it, and we know it. We pray that our leaders will get us out of this war, get us back on sound footing, Sam.
And we echo the call from stand-up religious leaders who are calling for peace. We echo that call for peace. We pray Donald Trump and others around him. We pray for them. We pray that they will embrace the principles of peace. There's got to be a way to step back from this war that I believe, if we're not very careful, might have no end. No end in sight, at least. That's for sure. Trump said no deal. Big move. Vance walks. Now what, right? Well, we'll keep an eye on the ball just for you. Lowell Nelson, campaignforliberty.org. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Sam.
I'm Sam Bushman. God save the Republic of the United States of America.